Hello everyone and welcome to another BlenderMadeEasy tutorial. Today we're going to be creating this satisfying rigid body simulation. And what's cool about this animation is that you can use any song that you want and any set of models. And the idea from this tutorial I actually got from Polygon's Instagram page. They have a lot of high quality renders and I definitely recommend checking them out. So in this tutorial, we're going to learn about animating displacement modifiers to the beat of the music. We're going to learn about rigid bodies, force fields, and then finally, I'll show you how to set up multiple camera angles and then render it out. So to get started, let's go ahead and delete the default cube and then add in an icosphere. This is going to be the object that we use to displace all of the other objects around it. In the settings here, we're going to set these subdivisions up to a level of 3. And then I'm going to scale it down to around 0.5 on the meters, right about here. Press Ctrl A and apply that scale. Now we can add in the displacement. So over in the modifier tab, I'm going to click add and then select displacement and then create a new texture. We're going to jump over to the texture panel and switch the type over to clouds and then set the size of this much lower to 0.1. One thing that I want to change is how this displacement works, because currently if we enable the colors, select color ramp down here, if we drag up the black value, you're going to notice it goes in the negative direction, which isn't really what I want. I want it to keep its original size but only extend outwards. So to fix that, we're going to select the black value, set this to 0.5, and now if we drag the gray up a little bit, you're going to see it keeps its original size and it's only extending outwards, which is what we want. So I'm going to drag this to around halfway in the color ramp, and then I'm going to drag the white value slightly to the left. Then we're going to jump over to the modifier tab and we can start animating the strength value. So every time the music drops, I want the strength value to spike upwards and then come back down. So what we'll do is we'll jump over to frame 50. We're going to set the strength to 0 and then add in a keyframe. We're going to go 3 frames later to 53, set the strength all the way up to a level of 2 and then add in another keyframe. Jump 1 frame later to 54, set it down to 0 and finally add that last keyframe. So here is what it's going to look like. Now if we were to duplicate these keyframes, you're going to notice that it's the exact same displacement, which is not very good and it's not going to be very random. So an easy way to fix that is to change the coordinates of this displacement. We can do this using another object. Let's add in an empty plane axis. What we're going to do is move this plane axis along the x direction, and that's going to be the coordinates. So underneath the x location, let's add in a driver. We'll go #frame divided by, let's go with 500. So for every single 500 frames, it's going to move 1 meter across and it's going to change the displacement. So we can select our icosphere now, set the coordinates to object, and then for that object, select the empty that we just added. So here is the first beat and you can see that's what it looks like. But then if we jump to the next beat, you can see it's different, and that's perfect. Now we are ready to add in the music, so I'm going to come up here to the top right and split this view and switch it over to the video sequence editor. Now again, you can use any song that you want, but if you want to use the same song, I'll put the link in the description. What you're going to do is go over to add, down to sound, and then navigate to the sound file. Mine is right here, select it and then add it in. I'm going to position this at frame 50, so we're going to move this over to frame 50 right there. And then to actually see what we're doing, press N and click on Display Waveform. So here is the beat of the music. What we're going to do is now line up every single drop to the strength value of 2. So right now it's actually correct. You can see right here it's at that beat drop. And now we need to move to the next beat drop right here and move these keyframes up a little bit. So press G and X and then move them over and place them right there. You can see there's 2 beat drops right here. So what I'll do is I'll position my cursor, Shift D these keyframes, move them over, and then place it right here, Shift D them one more time and move them over. So here is what it looks like. We're going to set the end frame in the timeline to 520, and I'm going to duplicate these keyframes all the way up to frame 330. Again, you can kind of customize this to your song and however long you want it to last for. And then at 360, all of the objects are going to explode outwards, and I'll show you how to do that later. So again, just jump over to the next beat drop, duplicate these keyframes, and then keep going. And there we go, we've added all the way to frame 330, and now we are ready to add in the rest of the objects. So what I'll do is I'll come up to the top right and create a new collection, and then select that collection, and we're gonna add them all to here. And now again, you can use any set of objects that you want, but if you want to use the Lego bricks, I'll put the link in the description for you guys to download them. Once you have that blend file, go over to File, down to Append, and then navigate to where that blend file is. Mine is right here. Go over to Lego Bricks, Collection, and then add in the Lego Bricks collection. And we can see them in our scene. So now what we'll do is we'll just drag them upwards. We'll go over to frame 50 so we can see how this looks right here. And you're just going to duplicate them and place them all over. Now they do have a set of materials, so every time you duplicate them, they're going to be a random color, which is pretty nice. So I'm going to position it right on top, Shift D, move them over, Shift D them over here, maybe rotate them upside down, and do something like this. Then I'll select all of them, and then Shift D, move them over here. And you're going to do this as many times as you want to get the number of objects that you want to fly around. And I think that is pretty good. I think that's a good number of objects. So now we can work on the simulation. So what I'll do is I'll jump over to that collection by holding Control and then left clicking on that collection too. And now we have just the objects. We're going to select everything and then select one of them to be the active object. Go over to Object, down to Rigid Body, and then click on Add Active. Then we're going to jump over to the physics panel, and the mass right here, we're going to go lower. Let's go with a value of 0.2. Now, there is an important thing I need to mention is the shape right here, the convex hull. Convex hull is basically a shrink wrap around your object, and that's going to be what is used for the collision. Now, if you have a more complicated object like a monkey head, for example, you may want to set the shape over here to mesh. But keep in mind this will slow down the simulation and make it take longer to bake. So if you can get away with it, leave it on convex hull and you should be okay. Then with that done, we're going to go over to Object, down to Rigid Body, and then click on Copy from Active. Now every single object should have that mass of 0.2. Now we'll jump back over to Collection 1 by hitting 1 on our keyboard, select the Icosphere, click on Rigid Body, set the type over to passive so it stays where it's at. And this time we need to set this over to mesh because convex hull is not going to work. We need to make sure it's set to mesh and then make sure deforming is turned on so it actually takes into account the displacement modifier. Now we need an object to pull all those objects into the center, and we're going to do this using a force field. So add in a force field. The strength of this is going to be set to -35. So it goes inwards instead of outwards. And what I want is for this object to actually move around at the beat drop at frame 360. So what we'll do is we'll zoom in here and find out where that drop is. It's right here, right where that frame is. So what I'll do is I'll hit I while hovering over this. We're going to add in a location keyframe. We're going to go one frame later, drag it upwards so it's above all of the objects. Add in another location keyframe, and then we also need to animate the strength value. So at frame 360, where it's right here, we're going to add in a keyframe, go to the next frame, and set this to 700. So now it's going to push all those objects down, and then they're going to scatter along the floor. So add in another keyframe. I only want the 700 to last for a couple of frames, so we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. Add in another keyframe. One more frame later, we're going to set the strength down to 0 and then add in that last keyframe. So for 5 frames, it's going to stay at a strength of 70, pushing all of the objects down and making a big explosion of Legos. Now, of course, we also need to add in that plane. So we're going to press Shift A, add in a mesh and then a plane object, drag them down and scale them upwards. Enable a rigid body, set the type over to passive, and that's basically all we really need to do. Now we are almost ready to bake this in. We're going to jump over to the scene panel and open up the rigid body world. There are a couple of things that we need to do here. First off, the substeps, we're going to set this up to 25. Since the object right here is moving very quickly with the displacement, substeps of 10 is not going to really work that well, so 25 should make it look pretty good. Next, the end frame, we're going to go up to 520. And then the gravity we're going to set to 0. And this value here we are also going to animate. So at frame 360, we're going to hover over the gravity, hit I, go to the next frame, 361, set the gravity up to 1, and then add in another keyframe. And with that done, we are ready to bake this in. Make sure you save your project just in case this crashes. Restart your simulation, and then click on Bake. Alright, the simulation has finished baking. Let's enable the collection 2 with all of the Lego bricks and then check it out. That looks pretty good. Let's go skip to frame 360 and make sure the bass drop is working properly. And that looks pretty cool. Now again, if you think the simulation is bouncing too much, what you can do is select the icosphere in the middle, switch this over to the graph editor, and then we can drag all of these. These are all the displacement set to a value of 2. Just box select all of them and then drag them down. Now the next step is to animate the camera a little bit. So we're going to go over to frame 50, jump into front view and press Ctrl Alt numpad 0 to snap the camera to place. Select it and then move it to where you want. For this first angle, I want it to start zooming in on the objects right here all the way up to frame 180. So I'm going to position it right about here, hit I, and add in a location rotation keyframe. Then we're going to jump all the way over to frame 180, zoom in a little bit, and also rotate the camera like this. Then add in another location rotation keyframe. I also want to make sure that these keyframes are set to linear and not Bezier, so select them both, press T, and select linear. So now it's going to move at a constant rate. That looks pretty good. The next thing I want to do is add in another camera angle. Now we could animate the camera moving to a different location, but the problem with this is when I enable motion blur in the render right here, it's going to create a very blurry frame, which is not what we want. So instead of doing that, we're going to add in a new camera. So press Shift A, add in a new camera object. And then on frame 180, we're going to press Control B with that camera selected in the timeline. And that's going to mark it for this frame. You also want to make sure that you select the original camera, jump to frame 1 and press Control B right there. So over the course of frame 1 to 180, it's going to use this camera. And then starting at frame 180, it's going to use the other camera. So for the other camera, I want it to go into the top view. So I'm going to press 7, place my view right about here, Control Alt numpad 0 to snap that camera to place. And for this one, I want it to zoom outwards. So right here, we're going to hit I, location, rotation. And then we're going to jump all the way to frame probably around 360 actually. Right about here. Let's do 59. Drag it up a little bit and maybe rotate it as well. Hit I and add in another location rotation keyframe. Make sure that these keyframes are set to linear, so press T and select linear. And then finally, for the last camera angle, I want it to be positioned right in the front so we can see the giant explosion. So again, add in one more camera, and on frame 359, press Control B. So now it's going to use camera 001. Go into front view once again, press Control Alt numpad 0. We'll zoom out a little bit, drag it down, and find a good location for this to see the entire explosion. So right about there looks pretty good. And for this one, it's just going to slowly zoom in. So at frame 359, right here, hit I and add in a location rotation, jump to the end and just zoom in just a little bit. Something like that will be good. And add in one last keyframe. So if we press Z and go into rendered view, we can see the lighting is just the basic setup, which doesn't look that great. So what I'm going to do actually is open up the film tab and enable transparency so we don't see the background. And then I'm also going to add in just a little bit more of a bright color. I'm going to select the point lamp right here, switch it over to a sun lamp, set the strength much lower to, let's say, like 5 or so. Rotate it and then just place it right about here. Something like that will look pretty good. That might be a bit too strong, so let's go even lower to like 3. And then over in the render tab, we're going to enable motion blur. The shutter is the amount of motion blur in your scene. I think a value of 0.5 is too much, so let's go lower to around 0.25. Then in the color management tab, we're going to set the look to very high contrast to make the Legos pop a bit more. And then for the plane itself, let's just create a new material very quickly, set the roughness to 0.1 or so. And that's basically all we really need to do. Let's jump over to this frame right here and see what the motion blur looks like. So I'm going to position the camera and then press F12 to render it out. Now I am using cycles for this render. If you don't want to use cycles, you can use Eevee. I just found cycles looks a bit better with the motion blur. And I think that is a good motion blur. I think that looks really nice. Also, make sure you select your icosphere and hide it from the view and hide it from the render so it does not show up. Now to add in a background, we're going to jump over to the compositing workspace right here, click use nodes, and we should see the render layers with the image that we just rendered. To actually see this, let's press Ctrl, Shift, and left click on the render layers to add in a viewer node. What we're going to do is add in a background. So I'm going to press Shift A, add in a color and then an alpha over node. We'll place that here. We need to make sure the image is going to go into the bottom input. And then this value here is what we can use for the background. Now you can use any color that you want, but I found that it looks pretty good to use the exact same color as the plane, so everything blends in pretty nicely. Then we're going to take the image and plug it into the composite. One last thing that I want to do is darken the edges just a little bit, and this will put the focus on the objects in the center. And we can do this by adding in a filter and then a blur node. We're also going to add in a distort and then a lens distortion. Set the distort up to a value of 1. You can take the image, plug it into the blur. And if we take a look at this by Control Shift left clicking on the blur, here is the result. So what we're going to do is change it over to the fast mode, turn on relative, and underneath the Y, we're going to set both of these values to 15%. And we can see that looks a lot better. If we then combine it by using a color and then a mix node, take the image of the blur, plug it into the bottom input. Let's see what this looks like. Make sure the mode is set over to multiply, and this will get rid of all of the white values but keep the black values. And there we go, that looks a lot better. Now the factor is how strong of an effect it is, because currently it's way too much, so let's set the factor to around 0.6. And that looks really nice. It's just a very subtle effect. You might go even a little bit higher, and that looks great. One thing to keep in mind if you're rendering this as an MP4 file and not an image sequence is over here in the audio settings, make sure you set the audio codecs from no audio to MP3, so the music will actually be in your animation. However, if you're going to render this as an image sequence, make sure you just do that later when you turn it into an MP4. What I'm going to do though is just render it as an MP4 because it won't take that long to render. I'm going to set the container to MPEG-4 and make sure the audio is right here. Then in the output tab, you need to set a folder of where it's going to go. And then also make sure you set the start frame down here to 50 to match when the simulation actually starts with the music. And with that done, we are ready to render. So go over to render and then click on render animation. But there we go guys, that is how you create a nice, satisfying, Instagram worthy simulation using rigid bodies. Thank you very much for watching, and if you created something cool, I would love to see it, so make sure to post it on Instagram and tag me at BlenderMadeEasy. And if you have other ideas for tutorials, let me know in the comments down below. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next one.